I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a show where we love to investigate elections, even those elections that don't happen. And it's also a show where we're very interested in how narratives of neo-populism ping-pong around the world. Amidst this year, 2024, the biggest year of elections in human history, the Tunisian election has largely been forgotten in the mainstream media. But you could argue it's one of the top 10 elections globally. It has so many important trends going on. Let's roll the clock back. Tunisia in 2011, people power, the overthrowing of an entrenched dictatorship. Tunisia was initially the poster child of the Arab Spring. Then, after the Libyan, Syrian, and Yemeni Arab Springs descended into civil wars, became protracted, and even the successful, quote-unquote, peaceful overthrow of Mubarak in Egypt slid back into dictatorship, Tunisia was the only remaining bright spot in what has sometimes been called the Arab winter, but no longer. Tunisia is not a bright spot, and if there's any bright spot, it can be brought by the guests that we're going to be speaking to. And now this topic is very close to my heart. Tunisia is a country that I really love. I visit whenever I can. I've been on 3 or 4 trade missions that have been hosted there on their way to Libya. I also launched the Arabic translation of my book at the Tunisian Book Fair. It was 2 years ago, in that occasion, that I was very honored to meet today's guest. So, let me just say, Tunisia, it is an Arab country, but it's so much more than that. It's a North African country, it's a Berber country, it has Islamic heritage, it has Jewish heritage, it has a touch of French Catholic heritage, and most importantly, it was scheduled to have presidential elections in the end of July of 2024. So now, today, we're super honored to be hearing from my close friend and leading oppositional presidential candidate, Olfa Hamdi. She is the founder and leader of the Third Republic Party of Tunisia, former CEO and Chairwoman of the Tunisian National Airline Tunisair. She's the founder and CEO of Concord Project Technologies, incorporated in California. Olfa, ahlan wa sahlan fil disorder.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And your introduction touched my heart. Being interviewed by somebody that loves Tunisia makes it even better. So thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
No, it's great. And I really look forward to you sharing some of your experiences with our audience who may not love Tunisia. They may not know it. Maybe some of them will have been there on a package holiday. Maybe some will have read newspaper headlines about Ben Ali being thrown out of power. But they may not have a sense of what it was like to grow up there. So tell us, most of your early elementary school and high school life was under this dictatorship of Ben Ali. What kind of a place was Tunisia at that time?
I grew up in the capital. I was actually born 1 year after Ben Ali took over power and had his coup. And so I would say I belong to this generation of Tunisians who lived both the end of the dictatorship and the beginning of the free period, the post-2011 uprising period. And the contrast is really, when you think about it, it was primarily the freedom side of things, the expression side of things, and the belief in opportunity for change. And so they chanted the slogan in 2011, which became the slogan of the revolution, which is شغل حرية كرامة وطنية, which is employment, freedom, dignity.
You forgot Wataniya, nationalism.
No, the national dignity. It's different, though. It's different than nationalism. But that was an equation, right? Employment, freedom, dignity. So Tunisians had this equation laid out and said, this is the blueprint for what we want to achieve. What happened is that the democratic transition focused primarily on the freedom part, which is freedom of expression, freedom of association, democracy, inclusivity, voices for all, human rights, and things like that, which are really critical and important. But then they all forgot the economy part, the employment part. And so when we go back to that, the day the uprising happened in Tunisia, it started with Bouazizi burning himself as an act of revolt because the government took away his fruit cart. So so it's an act of revolt against the expropriation of the government to his small property, which was his tool of creating his own wealth and making his own living. And so here, the root of what a Tunisian individual is somebody who believes in the sanctity of private property. So don't touch my property, don't touch my cart, don't touch my money, don't touch my land. Government, stay away. I mean, that was the act.
I want to jump in here, having been throughout the Arab world. I think I've been to 15 of the 21, hopefully soon to be 22 Arab countries. And I did find that Tunisia is imbued with an entrepreneurial energy of the kind that you might only find in, say, Lebanon or the UAE. Different, of course, than those contexts, but again, just to cast it for the listeners, something about the way that Tunisia as a seafaring nation, having its constitutional tradition in the 19th century, and that's what Olfa means when she talks about private property, the Tunisian individual. I think going back to the late 19th century, you had a larger middle class and more traders than you would have had, say, in Algeria or Morocco with very different economic systems.
Actually, great point, because when you look back at the first tax revolt in Tunisia's history, which was one of the very first, if not the first tax revolt in Africa, happened in 1861. We had what's called the Mejba revolt. This was at the time when the Bey, at the time, was like a king in a way, part of the Ottoman Empire, when Tunisia was part of the Ottoman era. And he basically raised taxes on everybody across the country because, he's running out of money to pay some of the very high interest loans he was getting from the European countries at the time, primarily Italy and France. And so when he raised taxes, there was a huge tax revolt, the Mejba revolt, which became so big and so significant. Actually, the leader of that revolt, his name was Ali bin Ghdayhem. He was called actually the king of the people. So in 1864, Tunisians chose their leader in a natural democratic act, even though there's no democracy per se then. And they actually revolted against the government raising taxes, which is primarily driven by the relationship of the individual with its government. When the government steps in, what happens if you look at the Economic Freedom Index and the rating of Tunisia in the Economic Freedom Index compared to other countries like the UAE and others, Tunisia ranks literally I think to 128 or so in the world. So it's actually one of the most unfree countries, economically speaking. It's close to a communist kind of system in a way, and which is completely contradictory to the nature of the people and their readiness. It contradicts with the nature of the people. And I think that's what creates instability in Tunisia.
Tell us about what it was like living in this Tunisian democracy after 2011, where there might not have been a big economic change, but there definitely was the freedom of expression you talk about. I remember listening to the radio in cab rides in Tunis, and you would hear wildly different opinions in the radio. And it might not have been a reasoned discussion, but you could say you didn't want Islam in the Constitution. You could say you did want Islam in the Constitution. You could say that you wanted a presidential system, a parliamentary system. It was an open discussion. How did that play out for you? And what went wrong over the next 10 years so that Tunisia has almost lost its democracy?
What happened in Tunisia is that the advancement of the democratic exercise was happening in a direction that was meant to be followed, if not jointly and in a synchronous way, be translated in economic freedom and free market policies and less cronyism from the state, but also the very few, those who kind of control certain sectors and things like that. What happened is that you have the inclusivity and the openness of the political space did not match the closeness and the rigidity of the economic space. And so that conflict, that contradiction, created a friction and a high level of dissatisfaction by the people, where they're basically saying, I elect you, government, so you're a government of the people, by the people, but not for the people anymore. What is that for the people piece? What is it? And so that created a huge mistrust into the overall process. And that mistrust is what opens the door for populists. I'm basically saying we went through this polarized political scene, and then the ballot box was the decision maker. And then after we go through that ballot box experience, then the very same guys who are opposing each other, they come together and they say, oh, the ballot box doesn't matter. We're going to agree to work together. And so what happened in Tunisia, 2019, we had this election, free, transparent election with two candidates. One that is a symbol of corruption and one that looks like a harmless, regular professor. And in Tunisia, a country that invests in public education, a professor is respected. And so Tunisians said, if I'm going to vote for corruption, it's going to look this way. But if I can vote for the unknown, let's dive into the unknown. And so in the context then, 2019, when Tunisians elected a professor, I think they made the right choice at the time. What happened is that that professor, the bait and switch strategy, turned out to be a communist, turned out to be having ideological belongings that were not disclosed publicly, which included basically this intersection of pan-Arabists, Islamists, and populists, and communists. There is an intersection, there is a political animal in the Arab world, which is born of the intersection of these families.
To understand what Olfa has said, Tunisia had a lot of unemployment, skilled people, many of whom have studied in France, many of whom know French or English. But what they wanted was jobs. And they're like, we got to get rid of Ben Ali and all these corrupt elites. But they didn't understand what it is to create competitive market-based economics. And I don't think that you can ask or even hope for a populist to know this. The American and British populace wouldn't understand these issues. They just happen to have those markets so embedded in our structural and political system. What was needed in Tunisia was the leaders to open up and solve the economic problem. So I want to go backward before getting to 2019. Tell us about the power-sharing deal between Nida Tunis and Rashid Ghannouchi. What aspects of that succeeded? What failed? How did we get to this situation where when you had a more secular wing and a more moderate Muslim Brotherhood wing working together, that the country was not able to pool its forces and move towards the future?
Let me put that question into the context of the democratic transition in Tunisia. I really believe Tunisians are actually on the process of doing a history record democratic transition in terms of its speed. In less than 13 years, Tunisians have experienced at the highest level of the executive branch 3 political families of different political orientations. They have had the Islamists in power as executive branch leaders, prime minister and so on. They had what's called the Destour forces, which are the nationalists of the older regime. And they have had the communists, the extreme left, the pan-Arabists sharing the power with Saied. So the left, the extreme left, the Islamists, and the nationalists in less than 13 years. What that does, that increases the consciousness of your base, of your people. And so now, when you look at all of the surveys, all of the polls, and I'm a political operator in Tunisia, I can tell you that. And my mere existence as a political force in Tunisia is because I'm preaching economic reform. And so economy and economic reform became a leading force in the political scene, to the point where you get leading parties and leading candidates who reflect that. And so what I'm basically saying, in Tunisia, the democratic transition, when you come out of a revolution, which was to overthrow a regime, it's like you have a volcano, right? Which was suppressed, and then you take the top part of it. What do you get? You get an eruption. And so that's a natural process of a social transformation, is to get an eruption. Sometimes the eruption could be violent, like what happened in Libya. But that's part of the learning process of the life cycle of a society.
Let's now explain for listeners, before we get more into what you're about, what happened in 2021? Foreign Policy has described what happened in Tunisia as a coup. A recent Foreign Policy article that I'm going to put a link to in the show notes said Tunisia is a rapidly backsliding democracy with an ever-growing slew of alleged human rights violations to its name. The Economist had called Tunisia a light unto the Arab nations just a decade ago, but now it may soon be fading into darkness. How did we have a coup that then led to a constitutional referendum, essentially ending the checks and balances of the democracy?
The National Security Council in Tunisia is regulated by an executive order, not by a law, not by an organic law voted in parliament. In 2017, the former prime minister published a new executive order regulating the National Security Council in Tunisia, in which he took literally an article from the constitution, which talks about the exceptional measures and in the case of Tunisia facing a very imminent danger. And he took that article and he copy-pasted it in an executive order regulating the National Security Council. And by doing a very simple act like that, he transferred the power from the parliament to actually regulate the executive branch, call in for some reason for exceptional measures and dissolving institutions and things like that. He transferred the power from parliament to the National Security Council. And what they did as well in that executive order regulating the National Security Council is that they eliminated the permanent role of the Tunisian military in the National Security Council. And so the National Security Council basically became literally any politician in power, any president. He can decide to gather a couple ministers, eliminate the military, eliminate everybody else, and call for the country to dissolve the entire country institutions with just one executive order. And there are no checks and balances.
They found a loophole and they exploited it, a legal loophole.
And the interesting fact is that this loophole happened in 2017, though. It got activated in 2019 by Saied and the current president, which, of course, he used that. And then from there, he went into this whole constitutional disorder.
This is a trend that we see in coups globally and neo-populism globally. No matter how robust it might appear your democratic institutions are, they're only as robust as the culture of the individuals that sit in them. And this is, I think, something that is important for people sitting in more established democracies to think about, that we're also prey to these same trends. So sticking with neo-populism here, one of the big issues in how Tunis is viewed from the European and NATO and American perspective is the issue of migration. What we've seen with the UK elections here is that whether it's as a protest vote or as a culture war topic, migration is essential in all European elections now. The EU elections, which saw the rise of the AfD, that's on an anti-migration vote. Meloni in Italy, she got into power because of an anti-migration candidacy, and Macron is being challenged by the National Rally and Le Pen from an anti-migration stance. Could you tell us what is the role that Tunisia plays in the movement of sub-Saharan migrants through to North Africa and to Europe? And how has the EU related to Tunisian politicians on this migrant issue?
In simple terms, Tunisia is the gateway of sub-Saharan migrants to Europe. And as a leading political player in North Africa, on the south of the Mediterranean, I would like to say that I'm extremely worried that the anti-migration anxiety of European politicians is threatening stability and security in the Mediterranean. Because this anti-migration anxiety is leading European leaders to try to take a shortcut into solving the problem for seasonal political gains. And the shortcut is leaning back to the old habits of dealing with the south of the Mediterranean as let's help dictators and let's help regimes who are minority regimes stay in power against the will of people and the will of the very same dynamic of that society, so that we can actually gain some seasonal gains and win some elections, but also because we're just anxious and we can no longer think short term, medium term, or long term.
I thought that was brilliantly put. It's so clear. Olfa is explaining a nature of our era of enduring disorder, which is that the tick-tockization, the instant feedback loop of the culture war has led to European leaders promising net migration will be down next year. This summer, we're going to prevent more people in getting to Europe on boats. So what they do is they bribe countries in the southern Mediterranean to prevent the people from getting on the boats without helping those countries grow their economy, grow the stability, to actually have a reason why people wouldn't want to migrate. They just have the most short-term approach that is like putting your finger in a dam. You can only hold the finger there for one season. By the next season, you lift the finger away and then more water comes through the dam. So
you know what that does? Because now it's so uncovered. A regular person anywhere in the world knows that Europe has the image, the perception, and you know, politics is perception, that Europe is giving up its values and can no longer take the moral high ground on democracy, on human rights, on any of those. Oh, Europe, we just don't want migrants. How much of your values does it cost? And you know, when you lose your moral authority in the world as the continent who went through so much to actually get back on that pedestal of being the leading moral authority in the world, you know what that happens? It creates a huge gap and a huge distance between the political leadership and the interests of the European people with the rest of the world. And it actually serves the agents of disorder all over the world who are trying. Basically, their very first step in spreading chaos is by taking away the moral ability and the moral, or the authority, the moral authority of the Western world. And so hundreds of years of democratic establishment and advancement and investment in people-to-people relationship, bridge building, human rights, all of that moral positive capital got totally destroyed in the span of like 4 years of this anti-migration policy anxiety that I call it anxious foreign policy.
Let's now talk about your candidacy, having laid the groundwork of problems in Tunisia, how its transition got off course, and then how European policy has been so misguided. Rather than focusing on, building up entrepreneurship, getting tourism back on track after the jihadi attacks, there's just been this dominance of the migration dossier in policymaking. I see you as someone who understands the economy, understands how to communicate, understands how to build wealth. So tell us, how did you get into politics? What are you running for? And how can people help support your cause?
How I got into politics. Technically speaking, the day I decided to become officially a politician is the day I was fired from the national airline after UGTT called for a Tunisian national strike across the entire economy for me to be fired, basically. So they basically said, she gets fired or we're doing a national strike across the entire economy. And that's when I realized, all right, it's about politics. Reform is about politics. The economic freedom of Tunisians is about politics. And if politics is the reason I was fired, then let me do the politics and get hired by the people instead of being hired by the elite who can fire you when you're no longer serving their interests.
You wanted to reform the system and make it more efficient.
Yes.
And you realized that couldn't be done without a true political authority from the people.
Yes.
Now tell us about your candidacy, what it stands for, how you're running your campaign, and also when is there going to be elections? How did the current quasi-dictator agree to allow there to be elections but delay them? Lay that groundwork for us.
So the election was supposed to be scheduled July 25th, 2024. We put so much pressure on him to have an election that he finally agreed to have one, which is now announced on October 6th, 2024, which is absurd, by the way, that we have to wait for the president to decide whether the election is going to happen or not. This should be an institutional process, and the ballot box is the ownership of the Tunisian people. Nobody owns the ballot box except the Tunisian people. So that's by itself is absurd. But anyway, that's part of the democratic transition that we need to, and the loose ends we need to tie for the system to stand. But then he agreed on one condition, that he would eliminate every single serious competition. He changed the age limit, even though it's against the electoral law, from 35 to 40 years old, basically eliminating me from the process. And so I'm like, okay, electoral laws don't matter anymore, looks like it. So the rule of law is being broken by a law professor. But this being said, the way I view things, when you're a political player, and that's where you asked me about my campaign, me running happened naturally, actually. So I was actually showing up in the polls for the presidential election without even running and without even thinking of running as president. And that was a surprise to everybody. But at the same time, that just showed me and showed a lot of people in my party that the Tunisian people are actually visionaries. So they actually, when they listen to what you're saying and they believe in what you're offering them, they just decided we want to see her in the presidential race. And so that's how I started 2 years ago, going up in the polls and being one of the leading candidates. How we're running the campaign, it's very simple. We call it basically open door politics. In our party, there are no conditions or prerequisites to join the party in Tunisia, the Third Republic. It's an open platform. If you're a Tunisian, per Tunisian law, you're 16 years old or more, you can join a party, so it's open for you. No preconditions. And the political platform overall, it's democratic in nature. So we basically said, even though the country is going through a democratic transition that's going through a hard time, we're going to be democratic ourselves. And so all local leaders are elected. I don't appoint anybody in the party or in the process. And it's a symbiotic relationship between my leadership, but also the people's contribution and direction to what I would be voicing. I would also say that in Tunisia's history, I know we've never had an Arab woman president in the history of the entire Arab world, by the way. It never happened in all of the Arab world. So the Arab League never had a woman sit there as president. So a lot of people might say, well, it's a long shot for a woman to become commander-in-chief in Tunisia and in the Arab world. We actually reached a point where we have 2 female candidates. I mean, the other one is in jail. I'm eliminated from, but we ended up with 2 female candidates in the top 4 of the voter intentions in the presidential election. And so female leadership in Tunisia is actually becoming a credible, real alternative. And that's what scares the minority president in power who decided, all right, I can't face the people. I know they won't vote for me, but let's do this. How about I don't give them a choice? And that way, when they go to choose, I'm their only choice. And so it's like a forced marriage in a way that's being orchestrated against the Tunisian people. The campaign continues, even though they try to eliminate me, of course, with these new illegal rules. But you never know, right? Things change. You never know how the dynamics happen. I'm a believer in the natural laws of the political sphere and space. I believe in stability through the political exercise. And so when you have a maneuvering by the establishment that's against the will of the way the dynamics are in the country, what that does, it automatically destabilizes the political scene and the country. And instability could show up in many ways. And that's what I worry about for my country. I worry about the breaking of the integrity of this election and the elimination of candidates. It would actually open or unlock fragility, and I'm worried about that.
After the break, how does the situation in Tunisia fit into the larger chessboard of geopolitics? Welcome back. We're here with Olfa Hamdi, a candidate in the October 2024 Tunisian presidential elections. She's the founder and leader of the Third Republic Party of Tunisia. Now, Olfa, before we order the disorder, we need to understand how Tunisia fits in a larger geopolitical matrix. Tunisia is obviously a small country, but it's in the center of the Mediterranean, and it has trade links not only with Europe, but with Africa and the Middle East. And one of the worrying trends from someone like me who's concerned about global disorder is the way in which Tunisia, which had been really connected with France, has seen those connections towards Europe gradually shifting towards Russia and China as Qais Saied is trying to become a disorderer and linked to the non-free world. Could you tell us how, just as he's moved Tunisia's politics away from democracy and towards autocracy, he's moved Tunisians' economy and geopolitics towards Russia and China?
Yes, the current president, he has started the process of unlocking Tunisia from its Western partners and moving Tunisia more toward what I call actually the communist bloc. I mean, I know some people might find this term old-fashioned, but I tell them, hey, communism simply evolved and changed. I mean, the ideology is still there. It's really about the absence of freedom and the government literally owning everything and people being subjects to the government. That ideology actually morphed itself into new ways, and that's what's happening in Tunisia. And so putting things into the geopolitics, Tunisia is at the intersection of the East and the West, has always been. So think about it as in the global fight or this dynamic happening at the global stage of free versus unfree or order versus disorder. Tunisia is a small playground for that very same global fight happening in Tunisia. And so this presidential election is actually also about that. Now, when you think about it, how was Saied able to gradually unlock, or he's working on the process of unlocking Tunisia from its Western partners? Okay. Step number one is to actually put the West in one basket. And, for example, use the very same Western countries like Italy and France. He created an alliance, which happened with Prime Minister Meloni, for example. And the deal is very simple. You keep migrants away, I will provide you political cover. That's what the deal is between what they call, the official line of the Italian government calls it the Saied-Meloni axis. Okay, that's a deal. That's a bilateral political deal, which when you put it in the context of how that deal makes all of the West pay the price and it creates mistrust between the Tunisian people and the rest of the Western countries. Now the rest of NATO, basically, all of the transatlantic partnership pays the price for a bilateral relationship between Meloni and Saied.
Could you give us some specifics about how the Russians and Chinese are making some plays in the Tunisian economy?
So here's the way the influence works. So Saied basically refused to get Tunisia to get an IMF loan. Well, it's not he refused. He sabotaged it in the first place. So it's part of his plan, is to sabotage Tunisia's negotiations with the IMF, Tunisian government's negotiation with the IMF, and then make a populist argument to the Tunisian people that IMF constraints and loans and conditions, which are really about the reform in the economy, are about what's called foreign Western diktats. And we have to stand up to the white man in Washington and in the IMF. So how is he replacing that? Very simple. In the budget law of 2024, they basically added few articles there which enable the government to literally provide state guarantees and finance the budget outside of conventional, traditional international institution loans, including the IMF. So the Chinese now basically is like, okay, we have a stadium. Why don't you guys do the works and then you own it for 50 years? Yeah, you can finance my needs, but I will provide you basically state guarantees that will literally provide them access to critical infrastructure, including ones that are of critical importance to our national security. And what he also started doing is he started legalizing what's called expropriation of private assets in Tunisia. So he already expropriated the private monies of businessmen in Tunisia. So in Tunisia, if you're an investor, even a foreign investor right now, and you have a lawsuit, even if the lawsuit is not with final judgment yet, the government takes away and transfers your money from your private bank account to the public bank account. And so we reached a level where expropriation, which is a typical communist policy basically, is becoming more and more on the norm. And the calls for nationalization of energy assets and things like that. And so, the process is simple. Let's sink the economy that was based on the ties of Tunisia with the Western world and Western institutions. Let's sink that, which creates this level of economic misery and despair in Tunisia, which gets the people to ask for questions and ask for action. And the answer we're going to give them is expropriation of assets. And then, now that we control the country, and I'm talking here like the communist mindset that's in power right now in Tunisia, or the whatever you want to call it, disorder mindset. Now that the Tunisians are so desperate for some economic relief, what we're going to do now, we're going to go and sit down and negotiate. Oh, okay, Italy, you have some energy assets and pipelines in Tunisia that are critical to your energy security. All right, I will keep that for you. But here's my conditions. Oh, you, Britain, no, I'm not interested. You guys, I'm just talking on their behalf, right? That's the whole, which is taking literally the economy hostage. It's the same process that happened when he took the democracy hostage. And this is the blueprint of the debt trap diplomacy. It's the blueprint of the way the Chinese, the political agenda of the Chinese. Because Tunisia for China is not just about economy, it's about politics. Russia in Tunisia, it's not about the economy only. I mean, the economy is a factor. It's about security and geopolitical progress. And so that's the dynamic we're having to deal with.
The Russians and Chinese exploit Tunisian economic weakness for their political gain. What they want is it to be disordered and not a part of the West. They don't really need the Tunisian economy, which for China, of course, is minusculely small.
From a Tunisian perspective, I see that the pressure that Europe is going through, which creates this anxiety on the European foreign policy, that pressure is actually sent back to DC, to Washington, and Washington basically is put and cornered between two fires. The fire of protecting its long-term ally, which is the other side of the transatlantic partnership, and the fire of expanding its interests and its national interests, the US national interests, on the south of the Mediterranean. And that only serves one purpose. When you look at it globally, and we look at it, what happened with the war in the Middle East and so on. All it does, I mean, this disorder, which I believe Saied is an agent of disorder.
I do as well.
What I do, I consider myself an agent of order. There is logic to the madness, and in that madness, the political exercise can help stabilize things. That's what I do. That's actually my forte. But when I look at it globally overall, the whole idea is that when you look at the world order in its old definition, the world order was based on, the rule of law internationally, world international institutions, the Vienna Convention, the US military presence and the creation of NATO, and all of these tools that were created post-World War II. If you want to create disorder all over the world, what you have to do is you have to break the leader of the free world, and that's the United States of America. You have to make it under so much pressure, with so many fires all over the world, then we no longer have somebody who can uphold the international rule of law and the world order.
Now, to order the disorder finally with our listeners, we like to conclude with some concrete policy suggestions. So, firstly, if you were queen for a day globally, what is the one international institution or one rule or policy you would bring into being?
Well, if I'm queen for a day of the entire world, I would gather all the rest of the world leaders, take them to a retreat, and get them to calm down. Seriously.
Okay.
That's it. I mean, all of these. I mean, when I look at it, as a leading politician, you know what's like one of my key nightmares? My key nightmares is having Arab boys playing with nuclear weapons in the backyard of Tunisia in the Middle East. My nightmare is because Putin has a dream of reviving the Soviet Union. My people are starving, and we had the wheat situation because he has a dream.
Yeah. That sketches out the need for global coordination and setting boundaries to human ambitions. It was also a very British solution you said there. It's essentially keep calm and carry on, and just culturally people just chill out and relax and work together. And I'm all about that. Next one, order the disorder with me. How can individuals, if they're working in think tanks, if they work in a policy institution like the Ministry of Defense here in the UK, how can they help Tunisia? How can they signal that it is important that Tunisia stays democratic and that there's this free and fair election in October?
First, the recognition that an election with the exact same conditions of 2019 and 2016, which were very successful elections before, seeing that connected and closely connected to the security situation and the security dynamic of Tunisia in its relationship to Europe, I would say for the European leaders, the British leaders, looking at Tunisia post the fact, when the election fails, when the election doesn't have the trust of the people, when the political crisis is deepened even further, maybe beyond repair, I would like to say, please, you can be on the preventive side of things. And the preventive side of things is, first of all, recognizing the presidential election. By the way, all of European leaders and Western leaders are silent about the presidential election in Tunisia. And silence is consent. So when you're silent about the abuse of the communists in power, changing the rules of the game, eliminating a candidate this late in the game, gaming the system, and forcing actually our armed forces to be in a position where they have to accept an election that is, everybody knows, and the Tunisian public opinion is quite clear that it's going in the direction of losing its integrity and credibility. What that does basically is that your silence is interpreted as consent. And when consent is considered as maybe a real policy from the Western side toward Tunisia's breakage of its own democracy, what that does, that creates a hint or a break into the trust bond between both our security forces and armed forces with NATO. Western silence on the presidential election breakage. Tunisians being alone in this process. Alone, we're fighting in darkness. We know where this road is going to take us. We know it's going to take us to the
Your
sword.
experiences in Tunisia. What is one thing that you would like to highlight to the orderers out there? What is one lesson that you'd like to draw and tell our mega orderers?
I like that, mega orderers. So now I'm part of the club? Is that what it is?
Wow, we'd be honored to have you in our club.
Thank you. Thank you. Mega orderers. You lose Tunisia to the disorder camp. The consequences are way bigger than Tunisians themselves only. These are regional consequences to the Mediterranean, to Europe, to the transatlantic alliance, to Africa. We cannot afford to lose Tunisia to the disorderers. As simple as that.
Olfa, it's been such a pleasure to have you on Disorder with me today. As always, if you want to hear our latest episodes, please tap follow now so whenever something new comes out, you'll have it as soon as it drops. Tunisia is a field that not everyone knows about. If you want some more background reading on this subject, please follow the links in the show notes for more about Qais Saied's coup, for the migration issue, for Iran, China, and Russia courting Tunisia, for the crackdown on human rights, which has happened in Tunisia. We have some really good links in the show notes. And if you want to know about the migration issue and how there's a kind of crooked deal between Meloni, and Saied, please follow our Substack where we're going to have more information about that. As always, this episode has been produced by George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. And lastly, amidst all this disorder in the world and the Mediterranean, I wish you an orderly week.